Your heart beats about 100,000 times a day, roughly 37 million times a year. And if you are lucky, it'll keep going for 80 years or so before it stops. That is the deal. That is the human lifespan, roughly 80 years give or take, and we've accepted that as a fundamental fact of biology. But 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians carved a list into clay that says otherwise. A list of real kings who ruled real cities for reigns that lasted tens of thousands of years. Not as myth, not as poetry, but in the same format they used for tax records and grain inventories. The driest, most bureaucratic document imaginable. If you are settling in for the night, this one is going to challenge something you think you know for certain. And if you drift off along the way, that is perfectly fine. Subscribe and stick around, because the question of why the Sumerians recorded impossible lifespans is one of the deepest unsolved puzzles in ancient history. The document at the center of this mystery is called the Sumerian King List, and it exists in multiple copies found at multiple sites across ancient Mesopotamia. The most complete version is the Weld-Blundell prism, a four-sided clay prism about 20 centimeters tall, covered in tiny cuneiform text, now in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. It was created around 1800 BCE, but scholars believe it records traditions that stretch back at least 1,000 years earlier. The king list is organized simply. It names a city, names the king who ruled there, states how long he ruled, and then moves to the next king or the next city. It reads like a spreadsheet: city name, ruler name, years of reign, city name, ruler name, years of reign, hundreds of entries in succession. And for the historical period, from about 2700 BCE onward, the king list is remarkably accurate. The kings it names are confirmed by other inscriptions, and the reign lengths match archaeological evidence. Gilgamesh appears on the list as king of Uruk, and archaeology has confirmed that Uruk was a major city during the period the list assigns to him. Dozens of other historically verified kings appear with reign lengths of 20, 30, 50 years, perfectly normal human lifespans that match what we know from other sources. This is an important point. The king list isn't unreliable in general. For the periods we can cross, reference it as one of the most accurate historical documents from the ancient world. But when you go backward in time on the king list, past the historical period, past the point where archaeology can confirm individual kings, the numbers change dramatically. The king list divides all of history into two eras, before the flood and after the flood, and the transition between them is marked by a single devastating line. Then the flood swept over. 5 words in Sumerian that separate the age of impossible numbers from the age of verifiable history. Before that line, the king list records 8 kings who ruled 5 cities over a combined span of 241,200 years. Let me say that again. 8 individuals ruling 5 real cities that archaeology has identified, for a combined total of nearly 250,000 years. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenlu Anna of Bad Tibera ruled for 43,200 years, the longest single reign on the entire list. Then Enmen Gal Anna for 28,800, Dumuzid the Shepherd for 36,000, and Sipad Zid Ana for 28,800. Enmen Durana of Sippar for 21,000 years, and finally Ubaratutu of Sharupak for 18,600 years. And then the flood swept over, and after it, the first post-flood king ruled for 1,260 years. Still enormous, but a fraction of the pre-flood numbers. Then 860, then 1,560. Then each successive dynasty showing shorter and shorter reigns until they reach historically normal spans. There is a clear mathematical pattern, not random numbers, but a consistent decay from enormous pre-flood values through diminishing post-flood values to normal human lifespans. Now the obvious question is whether anyone should take these numbers seriously. And the honest answer is that scholars have been arguing about it for over a century. There are essentially 5 major theories about what the pre-flood numbers mean, and each one has strengths and problems. Theory 1, the simplest, says the numbers are pure fiction, invented by scribes to make the pre-flood era seem grander and more impressive than the present. This is the default position for many historians. Ancient cultures frequently inflated the antiquity of their traditions to claim greater authority. and large numbers signal divine importance. The problem with this theory is the mathematical precision of the numbers. They're not random impressive-sounding figures. They follow specific mathematical patterns that suggest deliberate calculation. Theory 2 says the numbers are encoded using a different counting system than the one we assume, and when decoded properly, they yield much smaller values. The Sumerians used a base 60 system, and it is possible that later scribes misread earlier notations, interpreting what were meant to be smaller units as larger ones. Under one proposed recalculation, dividing the numbers by certain factors produces reign lengths in the range of hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands, still long but less absurd. The problem with this theory is that there is no consistent factor that converts all 8 reigns to reasonable values. Different scholars propose different divisors and get different results. Theory 3 says the reign lengths don't represent individual lifespans but dynasty lengths, the total time a particular ruling family held power at a given city. Under this reading, Ululim of Eridu didn't personally rule for 28,800 years. Rather, the House of Ululim governed Eridu for that period. This would make the numbers more plausible, but still enormous, and it contradicts the format of the king list itself, which clearly presents each entry as an individual. Theory 4 is the one that gets the most attention in alternative research circles, and it starts with a mathematical observation that can't be dismissed easily. Every single pre-flood reign length on the king list is a multiple of 3600, which is 60 squared, the foundational number of the Sumerian mathematical system. Ululim 28,800, that is 8 times 3600. Alalgar 36,000, that is 10 times 3600. And Menluana 43,212 times 3600. Every single number divides evenly by 60 squared with no remainder. The probability of 8 random numbers, all being exact multiples of 3600, is vanishingly small. These numbers were calculated, not invented arbitrarily. But what were they calculated from? What base values are being multiplied by 3600 to produce these specific results? Some researchers have noted that the multipliers themselves, 8, 10, 12, 8, 10, 8, form a pattern that echoes astronomical cycles. 3600 is also 1/7.2 of the precessional cycle of 25,920 years, and factors of 3600 appear throughout Sumerian astronomical calculations. This has led some scholars to suggest that the pre-flood reign lengths aren't biographical data at all, but encoded astronomical information, calendar cycles disguised as king lists. Under this reading, each king represents a celestial period, rather than a person, and the king list is a disguised astronomical record preserving cosmological knowledge in narrative form. Theory 5 is the most radical, and it simply asks, what if the numbers mean exactly what they say? What if the Sumerians recorded these specific numbers because beings with these specific lifespans actually existed, and the scribes were doing what scribes always did, writing down what they believed was true? The mainstream response is straightforward. No biological organism can live for tens of thousands of years. Human cells have a built-in limit called the Hayflick limit, and the laws of biology don't permit such lifespans. Telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes, shorten with each cell division, and eventually the cell can no longer divide. This is the mechanism of aging, and it applies to every complex organism. But the literal interpretation camp asks a different question. What if the pre-flood kings weren't human in the way we understand human? The Sumerian texts consistently describe the pre-flood rulers as having divine or semi-divine status. Kingship descended from heaven, and the kings who received it may not have been the same species as the humans who worked the fields. If the Anunnaki were real beings with a fundamentally different biology, their lifespans might have been genuinely different from human lifespans, and the king list might be recording their biology, not ours. This interpretation doesn't require believing in aliens or advanced technology. It only requires accepting that the Sumerians believed their early rulers were a different kind of being, which they clearly did. Each of these 5 theories has advocates, each has problems, and none can be definitively proven or disproven with current evidence. But there is an additional dimension to this puzzle that rarely gets discussed, and it involves comparing the Sumerian numbers to other ancient traditions. The Book of Genesis records its own list of impossibly long-lived individuals, the patriarchs from Adam to Noah, and the parallels with the Sumerian king list are too specific to ignore. Adam lived 930 years, Seth 912, Enosh 905, and the famous Methuselah lived the longest at 969 years. These numbers are much smaller than the Sumerian ones, hundreds rather than tens of thousands. But the structure is identical. Both traditions list specific named individuals with specific lifespan numbers. Both traditions show those lifespans declining after the flood, and both traditions treat the flood as the dividing line between the age of extraordinary longevity and the age of normal human life. If you are drifting off right now, that is perfectly fine. These mysteries will still be here waiting when you wake up. The patriarch Enoch is particularly interesting because he lived only 365 years, far less than the others, and the text says God took him, implying he was physically removed from earth rather than dying. The Sumerian king, Enmen-Durana of Sippar, has been identified by multiple scholars as the original figure behind Enoch. Both are seventh in their respective lists, and both are associated with being taken to the divine realm. Enmen-Durana was said to have been taught the secrets of heaven and earth by the gods, and then taken to live among them, exactly the tradition that later attached to Enoch. The last pre-flood figure in Genesis is Noah, who corresponds to the Sumerian Zasudra, the last king before the flood, and both survive the catastrophe and are treated as the bridge between the old world and the new. Two independent traditions, Sumerian and Hebrew, recording the same structure, the same declining lifespans, the same special seventh figure, and the same flood survivor at the end. The question is whether the Hebrews borrowed from the Sumerians or both inherited from a common older source, and the evidence points toward borrowing. The Sumerian king list predates the earliest possible composition of Genesis by at least 1,000 years, and the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE placed Jewish scribes in direct contact with Mesopotamian literary traditions. During the exile, Jewish scholars had access to Babylonian libraries containing the king list, the Atrahasis, the Gilgamesh epic, and other texts with impossibly long-lived figures. The lifespan numbers were dramatically reduced in the Hebrew adaptation, from tens of thousands to hundreds, but the structure was preserved, declining longevity before and after a flood. Some scholars argue the Hebrews deliberately reduced the numbers to make them seem more plausible, while preserving the essential tradition of pre-flood longevity. But others point out that the Hebrew numbers have their own mathematical properties that suggest independent calculation rather than simple borrowing. The Genesis patriarch lifespans contain multiples of 5 and 7, numbers sacred in Hebrew tradition, suggesting the Hebrews applied their own mathematical theology to the inherited structure. It is as if they took the Sumerian blueprint but replaced the Sumerian mathematical values with Hebrew ones, keeping the architecture while changing the decoration. There is another ancient tradition that records impossibly long lifespans, and it is geographically far enough from Mesopotamia to raise serious questions about independent invention. Hindu tradition divides cosmic time into yugas, great ages of declining length and declining human quality, and the lifespans attributed to humans in each yuga decline in exactly the same pattern. In the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, humans lived for 100,000 years. In the Treta Yuga, 10,000, in the Dvapara Yuga, 1,000, and in our current Kali Yuga, about 100. The same exponential decline in human lifespan appears in three unrelated traditions, Sumerian, Hebrew, and Hindu, all recording the same pattern of longevity decreasing from an ancient golden age. The total length of the four Hindu yugas is 4,320,000 years and 432,000. The Sumerian total for 10 pre-flood kings in one version is exactly 1/10 of this Hindu total. Three civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, recording the same mathematical pattern of declining lifespans from an ancient golden age. Either all three independently invented the same nostalgic fantasy about a better past, which is possible, or all three preserved different versions of a genuine memory that predates all of them. Let's examine the most overlooked aspect of the Sumerian king list's impossible numbers: the cities themselves. The 5 pre-flood cities on the king list, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak Sippar, and Shuruppak, are all real places that have been identified and at least partially excavated. Eridu, the first city, has occupation layers going back to approximately 5400 BCE, confirming it as one of the oldest permanently inhabited sites on Earth. Shuruppak, the last pre-flood city, has been excavated at Tel Farah and shows a clear flood deposit layer, sterile alluvial clay separating two distinct cultural periods. The kings are fictional or mythological, say the skeptics, but the cities are real, the sequence is correct, and one of them has physical flood evidence. Why would meticulous scribes who got the geography right and the post-flood history right suddenly become unreliable for the pre-flood period? Either they were recording a tradition they believed to be accurate, using the same administrative discipline they applied to everything else, or they deliberately invented the pre-flood section while keeping the post-flood section factual. Both options are strange. A document that is partially fabricated is unusual for Sumerian administrative practice, but a document that records literal 30,000-year reigns is unusual for any practice. There is a biological dimension to this question that deserves serious attention, because modern science has discovered things about aging that the Sumerians couldn't have known. Certain organisms on Earth live for extraordinary periods. The Greenland shark can live over 500 years. Some deep-sea corals are over 4,000 years old, and certain clonal organisms like the Pando aspen grove are estimated at over 80,000 years. The biological mechanisms that limit lifespan are not universal. They vary enormously between species, and some organisms appear to be biologically immortal, meaning they don't age in the way humans do. Lobsters, for example, continue producing telomerase throughout their lives, which prevents their chromosomes from shortening. They don't die of old age. They die of disease, predation, or growing too large to molt. The genetic research on aging has revealed that lifespan is controlled by a relatively small number of genes, and modifying these genes in laboratory organisms has produced dramatic lifespan extensions. Scientists have extended the lifespan of roundworms by a factor of 10 through single gene modifications, and similar research in mice has produced 2- and 3-fold extensions. This doesn't prove that ancient beings lived for thousands of years, but it does demonstrate that extreme longevity isn't biologically impossible. It is just not how our species is currently configured. If the pre-flood kings were a different type of being, as the Sumerians clearly stated, their biology might have been configured differently, with the genetic switches set to a much longer lifespan. The flood and its aftermath, described in the Atrahasis as introducing new limitations on human biology, could represent a genetic change, whether natural or imposed, that shortened lifespans permanently. There is one more pattern in the king list numbers that gets surprisingly little attention, and it involves the relationship between the pre-flood numbers and the post-flood numbers. The post-flood reign lengths don't jump immediately to normal. They decline gradually over many dynasties. The first dynasty of Kish after the flood shows reigns of 1,200, 900, and 600 years, still enormous, but an order of magnitude less than pre-flood values. By the time you reach the first dynasty of Ur, reigns are in the hundreds, and by the historically verified period they're in the tens, perfectly matching what we know about real human lifespans. This gradual decline is exactly what you'd expect if the numbers reflect a real biological process, a genetic change that takes multiple generations to fully express. If the pre-flood rulers carried genetics for extreme longevity, and the post-flood population was a bottleneck of mostly normal human genetics with some residual divine influence, you'd expect exactly this pattern. Each generation would dilute the longevity genes further, producing progressively shorter lifespans until the divine genetic contribution was essentially gone. This is speculative, obviously, but the mathematical curve fits a dilution model better than a random fabrication model, and that is worth noting. Still with us, or already somewhere in that space between waking and dreaming. Either way, there is more to explore. Let's address something that most discussions of the king list completely ignore: the existence of multiple copies with different numbers. The Weld-Blundell prism is the most complete king list, but at least 16 other copies and fragments survive, and they don't all agree on the numbers. Some versions give Enmen-Luana a reign of 43,200 years. Others give him 65,000 years. Still others give different numbers entirely. The total pre-flood span ranges from 241,200 in some versions to over 450,000 in others. This variation actually matters for the debate, because if the numbers were a standardized theological formula, you'd expect more consistency across copies, not less. The variation suggests that different scribes working from different source traditions or different oral accounts produced different numbers, which is what you'd expect if they were recording received information rather than generating it from a fixed formula. However, all versions agree on the core structure: 8 or 10 kings before the flood with extraordinarily long reigns, followed by a flood that resets everything, followed by kings with declining reign lengths. The specific numbers vary, but the pattern doesn't, which suggests the pattern itself is the core tradition and the exact numbers are secondary. So where does all of this leave us? What can we honestly say about the impossible lifespans on the Sumerian king list? Here is what we know for certain. The numbers exist on real tablets, carved by real scribes, in a document that is otherwise remarkably accurate for the periods we can verify. The numbers follow mathematical patterns that are not random. Every pre-flood reign is a multiple of 3,600, and the post-flood numbers show a smooth exponential decline toward normality. The same pattern of declining lifespans from a pre-flood golden age appears independently in Sumerian, Hebrew, and Hindu traditions, suggesting either shared inheritance or a universal human inclination to imagine a better past. Here is what we don't know. We don't know whether the numbers are literal, symbolic, encoded, or some combination that our interpretive framework can't accommodate. We don't know whether the pre-flood kings were real individuals, mythological figures, dynasty names, astronomical cycles, or something else entirely, and we don't know why multiple unrelated civilizations independently recorded the same pattern of declining longevity after a catastrophic flood. What we can say is that the Sumerian king list is not a careless or unsophisticated document. It is a precision instrument that combines verifiable history with unverifiable prehistory in a seamless format. The scribes who created it applied the same rigor to the pre-flood entries as to the post-flood ones, using the same format, the same terminology, and the same administrative discipline. Whether they were recording truth, encoding knowledge, or preserving a tradition they believed was sacred, they did it with the precision that characterized everything the Sumerians committed to clay. But there are other ancient traditions that record extreme longevity, and comparing them reveals patterns that are difficult to explain away as coincidence. The Egyptian king list recorded by the priest Manetho in the 3rd century BCE describes divine rulers who governed for thousands of years before the first human pharaohs. According to Manetho, the gods ruled Egypt for 13,900 years, followed by demigods who ruled for another 11,000 years before human pharaohs took over. The structure is identical to the Sumerian model: divine rulers with extraordinary lifespans, followed by declining longevity through semi-divine intermediaries down to normal human rulers. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus records that the Egyptians claimed their civilization stretched back over 23,000 years, with the earliest rulers being gods who walked among humans. Chinese tradition records the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, mythological rulers who reigned for extraordinary periods and taught humanity the arts of civilization. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, is credited with a reign of 100 years but a lifespan that various traditions extend to hundreds or thousands of years. Japanese mythology records the Kunitsukami, earthly gods who ruled for enormous periods before the first human emperor took the throne in 660 BCE. Every ancient civilization that developed writing independently recorded the same tradition: an age of divine or semi-divine rulers with extraordinary longevity, followed by a transition to normal human governance. The standard explanation is that this is a universal human psychological tendency. We idealize the past and imagine our ancestors as greater than ourselves. Every generation believes the previous one was stronger, wiser, and longer lived, and this nostalgia, projected backward through millennia, produces the illusion of a golden age. But this explanation doesn't account for the mathematical specificity of the Sumerian numbers, or for the identical declining curve that appears across unrelated traditions. Nostalgia says our ancestors lived longer. It doesn't produce base 60 multiples that align with astronomical constants across multiple independent cultures. Let's examine a specific aspect of the king list that almost never gets analyzed: the names of the pre-flood kings and what they might tell us. Sumerian royal names were not arbitrary. They were descriptive titles that encoded information about the person's role: divine patron, or accomplishments. Ululim, the first king, has a name that likely means stag, an animal associated with divine kingship and wild strength in Sumerian iconography. Alalgar, the second king, has been translated as big man or the one who is great, a straightforward title of authority. Enmenlu-Ana means Lord of the Divine Power, and Enmengal-Ana means Lord of the Great Divine Power, suggesting these figures were defined by their possession of cosmic authority. Dumuzid, the shepherd king, shares his name with the god of vegetation and the underworld, a deity whose death and resurrection symbolize the agricultural cycle. Ensipad-Zid-Ana means faithful shepherd lord. Enmendur-Ana means Lord of the Divine Power who connects heaven and earth, and Ubara-Tutu may mean friend of the sun god. These names don't describe human kings. They describe cosmic functionaries, beings whose identities were defined by their relationship to divine power rather than to human lineage. No historical Sumerian king has a name quite like these. Historical names reference personal achievements or family connections, while pre-flood names reference cosmic roles. This distinction in naming convention reinforces the king list's own assertion that the pre-flood era was fundamentally different from what came after. There is another dimension of the longevity question that connects to something we've discussed in previous episodes, and it involves the Apkallu, the seven sages. The Apkallu, the seven sages sent by Enki to teach humanity the arts of civilization, are all associated with the pre-flood period, each one serving a specific pre-flood king. Adapa, the first sage, served under the first king Ululim at Eridu, and subsequent sages served subsequent kings in the same sequence. The Babylonian historian Berosus preserved this tradition, naming the sages and specifying that each one lived during the reign of a specific pre-flood king, creating a parallel timeline. After the flood, no more pure Apkallu appear. Instead, the tradition describes Apkallu human hybrids, partial sages with diminished knowledge and shortened lifespans. This mirrors exactly the pattern of the king list. Pre-flood figures are divine and long-lived. Post-flood figures are increasingly human and shorter-lived, with a transition happening at the flood. Whether you interpret this as mythology, as memory, or as encoded information, the consistency across multiple independent textual traditions is striking. The Sumerians weren't telling one story about declining lifespans. They were telling it in multiple documents from multiple angles, all pointing to the same conclusion: something changed at the flood. Let's consider one more interpretation that has emerged in recent decades, and it comes from an unexpected direction. In 1998, a paper by Raja Matila and other scholars proposed that the pre-flood rain numbers encode the synodic periods of the visible planets. When you factor the pre-flood numbers using the Sumerian base 60 system and compare the results to known planetary periods, the correlations are surprisingly strong. The number 28,800, which appears 3 times in the king list, factors to 8 times 3,600, and 8 has specific astronomical significance in Mesopotamian tradition. Under this theory, the king list isn't a biographical record at all. It is a disguised astronomical almanac that uses the format of a king list to preserve planetary cycle information. The kings would be personifications of celestial bodies or cycles, their reign lengths representing orbital periods or synodic relationships expressed in base 60 arithmetic. This would explain both the mathematical precision of the numbers and their impossibility as biological lifespans. They were never meant to be lifespans at all. The problem with this theory is that the correlations, while suggestive, aren't exact enough to be conclusive, and the method requires selective factoring that critics call cherry picking. But the theory highlights an important point. The Sumerians were capable of encoding complex information in unexpected formats, and their mathematical sophistication means we can't assume the simplest reading is the correct one. There is a philosophical dimension to the king list's impossible numbers that is often overlooked in the debate about what they literally mean. The Sumerians weren't the only ancient civilization to associate extreme longevity with proximity to the divine. It is a near-universal association in ancient thought. In almost every tradition, the closer a being is to the gods or to the original creation, the longer they live, and as beings become more separated from the divine source, their lifespans decrease. This suggests that, for ancient peoples, lifespan wasn't purely a biological concept. It was a measure of spiritual or ontological distance from the source of existence. The pre-flood kings live for tens of thousands of years because they're close to the moment of creation, when divine and earthly realms overlapped. The post-flood kings live for progressively shorter periods because each generation moves farther from that original divine contact, like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in water. The flood is the moment of maximum separation, when the gods deliberately widen the gap between themselves and humanity, and the declining lifespans measure the growing distance. Under this reading, the numbers aren't biological data. They're theological data, measuring something real but not physical, the degree of connection between mortal and divine. This interpretation doesn't dismiss the numbers, it recontextualizes them. The Sumerians may have been measuring something real, but using lifespan as the unit of measurement. And this leads to a final question that sits at the heart of this entire mystery. The real question isn't whether ancient kings literally lived for 30,000 years. It is why multiple independent civilizations across the globe recorded the same specific pattern of declining longevity from a pre-catastrophe era. If it is pure psychology, universal human nostalgia for a better past, then why does it follow mathematical curves rather than random exaggeration? If it is cultural borrowing, Sumerian influence spreading to other civilizations, then why does the pattern appear in traditions like Hindu and Chinese that had minimal contact with Mesopotamia during the relevant periods? If it is encoded astronomical data, then why does the same encoding show up in cultures that used different astronomical systems and different number bases? And if it is a real memory of actual beings with actual extreme longevity, then where is the physical evidence? Where are the bones, the settlements, the artifacts of beings who lived for millennia? Every theory explains some of the evidence and fails to explain the rest. No single interpretation accounts for all the data. And that is what makes this genuinely unsolved. Not unsolved because we haven't tried hard enough, but unsolved because the evidence resists every framework we've applied to it. The Weld Blundell prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a small clay object you could hold in one hand, covered in tiny cuneiform marks. In 2003, researchers completed the Human Genome Project, mapping the entire sequence of human DNA for the first time. And what they found added an unexpected dimension to the longevity question. The human genome contains approximately 20,000 protein-coding genes, but only a handful of those genes directly control aging, and those aging genes show evidence of having been modified or constrained at some point in our evolutionary history. The gene FOXO3, sometimes called the longevity gene, appears in virtually every organism that lives beyond expectations, from centenarian humans to long-lived animal species. Certain variants of FOXO3 are dramatically overrepresented in populations of people who live past 100, suggesting that longevity isn't random luck, but a genetic inheritance. The gene SIRT1 regulates cellular repair and stress resistance, and when researchers activate it in laboratory animals, the animals live significantly longer and show delayed aging across every biological system. What is fascinating is that these longevity genes appear to be partially suppressed in modern humans. They exist in our DNA but aren't fully active, as if someone or something turned the dial down. When scientists ask why human lifespan is limited to roughly 80 years when our cells theoretically could maintain themselves much longer, the answer comes back to these partially suppressed genes. The Sumerians said the gods imposed new limitations on human biology after the flood, and modern genetics has confirmed that human longevity is indeed genetically constrained in ways that aren't fully explained by natural selection alone. That is not proof that the Sumerians were right, but it is a coincidence worth noting. Our biology is limited by genetic constraints that science can identify, but can't fully explain. There is also the question of what the Sumerian king list implies about the nature of time itself, because the text may not be measuring time the way we assume. Modern physics has demonstrated that time is not absolute. Einstein proved that time passes at different rates depending on velocity and gravitational fields. At speeds approaching the speed of light, or in intense gravitational fields, time dilates. A year experienced by one observer can correspond to thousands of years for another. If the pre-flood kings originated from a context with different gravitational conditions, or if the Sumerian concept of a year referred to a different temporal unit than our solar year, the numbers might be reconcilable. This is speculative, but it illustrates an important point. We assume the Sumerians meant solar years when they wrote these numbers, and that assumption may be wrong. The Sumerian word for year, mu, can also mean orbit or cycle, and it is possible that the pre-flood sections use mu to mean a different cycle than the solar year. If mu in the pre-flood context refers to a shorter cycle, perhaps a lunar month, perhaps a season, then dividing by 12 or 4 produces numbers in the hundreds or thousands rather than tens of thousands. The problem with this interpretation is that the Sumerians had separate words for month and season, and the king list uses the specific term for year consistently throughout both pre-flood and post-flood sections. If they meant months, they would have written months. The Sumerians were precise with their units and didn't use them interchangeably. This brings us back to the fundamental impasse. The numbers are too precise to be random, too large to be literal, too consistent across traditions to be coincidental, and too resistant to reinterpretation to be easily explained away. Let's examine one final aspect of this mystery: the curious fact that the post-flood king list has been largely vindicated by archaeology, while the pre-flood section remains unverifiable. As we've discussed, the post-flood king list names dozens of kings who have been independently confirmed through inscriptions, building projects, and administrative records. Enmebaragi of Kish, listed in the king list, was confirmed by an inscription found at Nippur, making him the earliest independently verified ruler on the list. Gilgamesh, listed as king of Uruk, was long considered purely mythological until inscriptions were found that confirmed a historical Gilgamesh ruled Uruk during the early dynastic period. The pattern is consistent. Every time archaeology catches up to the king list turns out to have been right. Names that seemed mythological prove to be historical. This creates an uncomfortable situation for scholars who want to dismiss the pre-flood section as pure fiction, because the document has earned credibility in every section we can verify. A document that is wrong about things we can check would be easy to dismiss. A document that is consistently right about things we can check, but makes extraordinary claims about things we can't, is much harder to evaluate. We can't check the pre-flood section because the flood deposits separate it from verifiable archaeology, and anything below the flood layer belongs to a world we can only access through texts. The flood, whether it was a single event or a series of catastrophes, destroyed the physical evidence for the period the king list describes with impossible numbers. This means the pre-flood section of the king list may be accurate in ways we can never confirm, or fictional in ways we can never prove, and we're left with the numbers themselves as our only evidence. So here we are, at the end of this particular mystery, and the honest answer is that we don't know what the Sumerian king list's pre-flood numbers mean. We know the numbers are mathematically structured. We know the pattern appears across multiple civilizations. We know the cities are real, and the post-flood section is accurate. We know modern genetics confirms that human longevity is genetically constrained in ways that aren't fully explained. And we know the Sumerians treated this document with the same administrative rigor they applied to everything. What we don't know is whether these are literal lifespans, encoded astronomical data, dynasty lengths, theological measurements, or something our categories can't accommodate. And that unsolved quality is what makes the king list one of the most important documents from the ancient world, because it forces us to confront the limits of what we can know about a civilization that existed 5,000 years ago. The skeptical position on the king list usually boils down to a simple argument. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and there is no extraordinary evidence for 30,000-year lifespans. This is a reasonable position, but it overlooks something important. The king list isn't making an isolated extraordinary claim. It is part of a vast interconnected body of literature that tells a consistent story. The Atrahasis explains why lifespans declined. The gods imposed biological limitations after the flood as part of a negotiated compromise. The sage traditions explain the parallel decline in divine knowledge, as Apkallu gave way to human Apkallu hybrids, and finally to ordinary human scholars. The temple records describe the declining frequency of divine communication, from gods walking among humans to gods speaking through dreams, to gods falling silent altogether. Multiple independent textual traditions within Sumerian literature all describe the same transition from an era of divine proximity with extreme longevity to an era of divine distance with normal lifespans. Dismissing the king list numbers means dismissing not one text but an entire literary tradition, and doing so requires assuming that the most meticulous scribal culture in the ancient world was systematically wrong about its own origins. They may have been wrong. Ancient peoples were wrong about many things, but they weren't careless, and the consistency of their claims across multiple genres of writing demands a more nuanced response than simple dismissal. The numbers on the king list may not mean what they appear to mean, but they mean something, and that something was important enough to preserve for 5,000 years. Whatever the pre-flood reign lengths represent, they represent it precisely, deliberately, and consistently, and that level of care from the oldest literate civilization on Earth deserves our attention. And this brings us to something that deserves emphasis. The Sumerian scribes who carved the king list weren't creating entertainment. They were performing an act of institutional record-keeping. They used the same format, the same vocabulary, and the same administrative conventions for the pre-flood section as for the post-flood section. They made no distinction in how they treated the data, whether they were recording truth, preserving tradition, or encoding information. They were doing it with the full authority and precision of the most sophisticated bureaucracy the ancient world had ever produced. The honest answer is we don't know, and the honest response to not knowing is continued investigation, not premature closure. New tablets are translated every year. New mathematical analyses are applied to the numbers, and new archaeological discoveries at Eridu and Shuruppak and the other antediluvian cities continue to provide context. Someday someone may crack the code, find the key that makes the numbers make sense in a way that everyone can agree on, or find evidence that settles the question one way or another. Until then, the numbers wait in clay, patient and impossible and precise, exactly where the scribes left them 5,000 years ago. The Weld Blundell prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum, a small clay object you could hold in one hand, covered in tiny cuneiform marks that have been puzzling scholars for over a century. 8 kings, 5 cities, nearly 250,000 years. Then the flood swept over, and everything changed. Your heartbeat, the one you can feel right now if you put your hand on your chest, will keep going for roughly 80 years if you are fortunate. The oldest written record on Earth says that once, before a flood changed everything, beings who ruled real cities and real places kept their hearts beating for tens of thousands of years. Whether that is memory, metaphor, mathematics, or something our categories can't contain, it was important enough for the oldest civilization on Earth to carve it into clay and preserve it forever. These mysteries have been waiting thousands of years for answers. They'll wait until morning. Sleep well, and when you wake up, your heart will still be counting, just as it was designed to do for whatever number of years was written into your particular biology. Sleep well. Good night, and thank you for spending this time with numbers that have been confounding brilliant people for over a century.